What makes an object nice to use? This is a milk frother my housemate got. It has a metal housing, and it came with this metal stand for our kitchen counter. It fits nice and snug, if a little wobbly. It has some issues though. It's not very powerful, it charges with micro USB instead of USB-C, and it burned out. So my housemate got a new one, and it's much more powerful than its predecessor, which is nice. It charges with USB-C, which is nice, and it actually works. So why do I hate using it? It has cheap plastic housing, silver paint that's coming off, mushy buttons, and it neither fits the stand we have, nor did it come with its own. But why do I care? It's a frother. Is there a more frivolous kitchen appliance than the milk frother? Why am I compelled to tear this thing apart and make it whatever my idea is of nice to use? I thought it was silly, but once we had it in the house, I started using it daily. Turns out I like milk drinks. But it also turns out a milk frother doubles as a cordless, kind of weak immersion blender, which is actually very useful. It's like having a 12-volt cordless drill instead of a corded one. It's usually all I need, and it's way more convenient. So I'm using this thing every day, and these little annoyances build up. The bad hand feel, having nowhere good to put it, all this became an irritation, a pebble in my shoe. So, more out of spite than anything else, I took it upon myself to gut this thing. My first idea was to make a new housing out of a 2x4 I had in the workroom, and had I followed through on this, the result may well have been nicer. But, whatever. My electric saw got stolen a while back, and I never replaced it, so this is a bit harder than it has to be, just using a pull saw. Here's a technique I use a lot. You can draw a straight line parallel to an edge just by holding a finger to the edge. It's quicker and easier than using a ruler. So I was going to cut this wood in half. But then at some point I thought, what if I made this out of scrap plywood instead? At the time I felt like it'd be easier to work with. And who knows, maybe it could pick up a cool Tom Sachs kind of look. Turns out, there are some reasons kitchen appliances are not usually made out of plywood. We'll get into that later. So I make some sloppy cuts and wonder to myself, is this really going to be an improvement? Did I just destroy my housemate's frother only to replace it with more trash? But then I tell myself, on a basic functional level, nothing's changing. It's still a frother, it'll still froth. It's just that now it's up to me to make sure it becomes a nice frother. And I guess my hunch here is that it comes down to aesthetics. The aesthetic, for me, of thin plastic, especially when it has a bad silver paint job, conjures up associations of waste and even half-hearted deception. Like it wants me to think that it's metal, but it's not even trying very hard to convince me. Which honestly feels a little insulting. On the other hand, there's a kind of DIY garage aesthetic to plywood, especially cut by hand, inexpertly, and without a real plan. Just the confidence that it'll come together somehow. And I guess I do like that. So I do all this cutting to get 3 pieces of ply. This thing's going to be about 1 inch wide. And maybe it's the American in me, but I do like inches. 1 inch feels like a very human unit somehow. 1 inch is a nice size for a small object to hold in your hand. But maybe that's just familiarity talking. I know metric is the more sensible system, and I prefer it for almost everything. But there's something nice about the wonkiness of inches. I've been thinking a bunch lately about how the main reason the imperial system is worse is there's a mismatch with our base 10 numbering system. And if we use base 12, imperial would make a lot more sense. Sometimes it feels like we have these weird vestiges of an alternate number system floating around, like how we measure time. Oh, here's that finger along the edge trick again. Not necessarily the most precise, but it works. This is called a coping saw. It uses these skinny little blades that you can detach from each end to thread the blade through the piece and reconnect it to the handle so you can saw out holes. Very useful. The holes I've drilled allow me to insert the blade and also turn it when I hit a corner. I'll just pop that guy out. Doesn't fit yet. Okay. Here I'm using my rotary tool to expand and smooth out the hole, but it gets kind of annoying to do, so I switch to a hammer and chisel, going with the grain of the outer sheets on these long edges. I keep checking as I go, don't want to overdo it, and just shave off bit by bit. Okay, that's this end looking good. Now to flip it around and chisel out the other side. It's very satisfying. There we go. But it's a little short still, and since the short sides are so small and against the grain, I go back to the rotary tool, just to extend them a bit. There it is, nice and snug. But we still have the other components to account for. The wires, the PCBs, the motor. It's the same process. Rough cut with coping saw, refine with chisel and rotary tool. So much work for such a small thing. At this point, I'm realizing just how much I've committed myself to. Why'd I fixate on this? Lots of objects can go unnoticed. Using them becomes routine and they become invisible. But some objects, like the frother in my case, become an irritant, stressful even. But this can go the other way too, right? An object can become a source of joy, not just in its obvious function, but in how you use it, how it feels, how it looks. Something I'm really drawn to that you'll see in a lot of my projects is making something in a fairly loose, improvisational style without much of a plan, and then refining it, finding the most compelling aspects of what was improvised and developing them into something that feels intentional. Designed, even. I need to secure that USB board, so I'll drill a little hole and screw it in. Now for the motor. Same deal as before. Drilling out the corners makes it much easier to change direction while cutting with the saw. And you can see where some of the plywood problems start to crop up. But at this point, I'm in too deep, and I want to froth my milk tomorrow morning, so I gotta just keep trucking. No need to measure for the side panels. I just trace the holes I've already made. These aren't going to go all the way through, but they need to be hollowed out a bit so the components will fit, which means more chisel. This is 3-ply plywood, meaning there are 3 layers. The outer layers have grain running in the same direction, but the middle layer's grain is perpendicular to theirs. When it's all together in a big sheet, this alternating grain makes the plywood strong. But when you do fiddly little stuff like this, you suddenly wind up with a bunch of very thin, weak cross-grain areas, which wind up breaking loose and causing problems. Which is why I probably should have stuck with the 2x4 at the beginning. Alright, a little test fit. I'll need to clear more space for the motor shaft. Okay, and on the other side, I'll need to make some room for the circuit boards. I'm going to try a different technique here. I'll route it out. I don't have a router attachment for my rotary tool, so I'm just freehanding this. It winds up being a lot easier to dip directly into the ply and make a series of holes instead of trying to drag the bit sideways through it. I just go around the edges to make chiseling out the guts a bit easier. That is satisfying. Ooh, but I've done some damage. See, and it's the middle ply that's falling apart there, because where the top part is made of these long, strong strands running along the length of the piece, the grain in the middle is perpendicular. So it's just like a pile of super short strands that can break apart very easily. Nothing some wood glue can't fix, hopefully. So I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who's supported this new little channel, the over 3,500 of you that have subscribed, and especially the folks who have become members, both here on YouTube and at my site, paradiso.zone. And here they are. Thank you so much. You make videos like this possible. So if you're enjoying the video, give it a like, comment, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe. You know how this works. If you'd like to support the channel and get some cool stuff, you can join the ranks of these lovely folks by becoming a member. You can do that on YouTube or at my website, paradiso.zone. And while you're at it, why not check out the store at paradiso.works. And finally, for people who are mostly here for tabletop game stuff, don't worry, there's plenty coming. All right, back to it. Now that everything fits, these are going to be held together by screws in the corners. I don't have a countersink bit, so I just hit the holes for a moment with a larger drill bit, so the screws can sit flush to the surface. I'll be sanding all this, but some of the unevenness is pretty extreme, so I'm cutting it down first. Now to smooth everything out a bit, make it a bit more pleasant to hold. And it looks like I broke the connection to the motor somehow, so I'll strip the wire and resolder that. Okay. Now there's a button on the main board, so I'm measuring its location and drilling a hole for it in the top piece, which I then widen a bit with a larger drill bit, and repeat that for the power LED. And once more for the charging LED. Alright, I found this neat little red button in a pile of electronics junk, but the hole is too narrow for my purposes, so I carefully widen it, slowly increasing the girth of the drill bits as I go. Oop, get back here. Hey. Next, I mix up a tiny bit of this epoxy putty and put it on the cap of this screw. This will make sense in a moment. The rest of the putty goes in the widened hole on the button. I've slathered the screw in petroleum jelly, and I just screw it in there. Smooth out the putty, and let it cure for a few hours. While we wait for that assembly to set up, let's fill some of these holes I made with my cross-grain foolishness. Thankfully, none of these are really structural, otherwise I'd be using more epoxy putty instead of wood filler. Once the putty cures, we can take the button assembly apart. I covered the threads in petroleum jelly so that the putty wouldn't stick to them. So I put the putty on the head to fill in the Phillips slot, because I'll be using the head of the screw to push the button. So I want a flat surface there. Right now it's too thick, so I wrap a little piece of silicone around it to protect the threads and hold it with pliers as I grind it down with the rotary tool. This is really fun. The sparks are so pretty, and it's wild that they're glowing hot metal, and yet they can bounce off your skin without harming you. And there it is, ground flat with the puttied up center, and it just goes right in the buttonhole, like that. Fit the board in place, and hey, it works. So I think I shortened that wire too much when I resoldered it, so now the motor is having a hard time fitting. So it's time to get the soldering iron out again, and extend them with some extra wire. So I also don't have heat shrink tubing, so once again I need to improvise. Green stuff epoxy putty will stick nicely, and it's flexible, so that should work to shield the connections. And let's just clean this up before the motor goes back in. Okay, now I'm just kind of noodling on what I want the front of this thing to look like. Sketching on there in pencil, which is the only real planning this project has had, and I don't want to overdo it, so it's time to commit. I'm hitting the lines with this wood burning tool, which is also my soldering iron and a 3D printing pen. It's from Sonego, the Korean 3D pen guy who fills in cracks in walls and makes models and fixes people's stuff. Another channel I'd recommend if you haven't seen it. So here I'm getting a nice outline, which I then decide to double up. And actually I don't like it. So back to the rotary tool. I'm just going to route out this shape and have the face be a little bit inset. Eventually I figure out that this round bit is a lot easier to use at this angle. And I just carve away. Gotta be extra careful around these details. And then smooth it out with a little sandpaper. I'm using wood glue to connect the middle piece to the bottom, but the top will just be held in place with the corner screws. All the electronic guts can be removed from the top, and I want this reborn frother to be easy to open up and repair. A practical choice for sure, but also an aesthetic one. To me, there's a beauty in conspicuous repairability. I'll clamp this together and let it set up. Okay, time to get a layer of varnish on this thing. You want to get your piece as smooth as possible before varnishing and also between layers of varnish. So once the first layer cures, I sand it down once again. Always going from coarse to fine. And I blast the dust away with compressed air so it doesn't get caught in the next layer of varnish. And let's get some paint on here. The poly varnish should help prevent the paint from bleeding into the wood, which will keep the edges crisp. I'm using a Posca paint marker for this. They're really nice and fun to use. Just being very careful with the details and edges, and then filling it all in. Another deeply satisfying step. Once that dries, I use a fine tip white paint marker to label the lights and the button. And a label for the whole object, I guess. It's a frother. Looking good. Now, clearly, this isn't going to fit in that stand from the original frother, but that's fine. I have a better plan. I use a piece of tape on the drill as a visual reference to ensure I don't go too deep. And this is just the right size for one of the many neodymium magnets in the workshop. Some CA glue and accelerator will fix it in place. Same on the other end. And these stick out a bit intentionally to keep the frother head away from whatever surface you stick it to. Okay, let's seal everything in with another coat of varnish. And it's assembly time. The guts go in the bottom. The ground down screw goes out through the hole in the top. The button head screws right on. Not too tight, there needs to be a little travel. And I press fit the main board into the top, close it up, and screw it down. Last part, the frother head. I chopped and sanded this connector down to fit in the new housing. And here I'm priming it with a few coats of Vallejo flat primer, and then a red Posca paint pen. And finally, a little varnish to protect the paint. And it just plugs in. Lo and behold, a milk frother that I like. USB-C port is up top now instead of on the side. This button feels so much nicer. There's big, bold labels, and it's just nice to hold. Let's let this charge for a sec. And there's the charging LED lighting up. All right, time to make a drink. Thankfully, my housemates share at least some of my tastes, and they quite like the new frother. So, what makes an object nice to use? I guess every time I held the old frother, I was reminded of cheap manufacturing, cutting corners, mass production, planned obsolescence, the logic of capital, and so on. It's just not what I want to think about first thing in the morning. But when I look at the new frother, and I pick it up and use it, I think of making and repairing things. I think of creating little gifts for my household. I think of the beauty of practicality. And that makes my morning drink just a little bit sweeter. I may have overfrothed this one. Oh well. Thanks for watching. And thanks for your support.